Now to introduce our presenter for tonight's lecture. Laura Cruz is a garden designer and horticulturist based in the Philadelphia region. Inspired by nature, ecologically minded horticulture is her passion and expertise. She holds a Master's of Landscape Architecture from the University of Sheffield and has worked for over a decade with her hands in the soil, primarily in public horticulture and the nursery industry. Currently a private estate horticulturist, Laura also provides garden design and consultation services. We can't wait to hear from Laura tonight, so at this point, I will turn things over to her to get us started. Hi, Laura.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Amy, so much for that lovely introduction. If all of you can be a bit patient, I will get started with the presentation. So again, thank you, Amy, and thank you, Jenkins Arboretum, for having me here tonight to speak as part of your Third Thursday lecture series. I imagine all of you are here tonight, probably because you are working with a small garden space. But whether you have a tiny backyard garden or just a front stoop with room for a container or two, I really hope you'll get a lot out of this presentation. This won't be a lecture where I just give you a whole bunch of plants, a list of a whole bunch of plants, because any good nursery will tell you the eventual size of the plant and their description so you can find smaller plants. Don't worry, I will give you some plant recommendations, but I'll go beyond that and give you ideas and inspiration on how to get the most out of those plants in whatever space you have. So a little bit of background about me. I grew up in Chatsford, PA, not too far from Jenkins Arboretum, and spent a lot of time with my family walking in the woods locally. We also visited many public gardens. We were frequent visitors of Longwood Gardens, especially because it was close by. But I didn't always know I wanted to be a horticulturist or a designer. I actually studied psychology as an undergrad and worked as a mental health caseworker for several years in Northern Delaware before I completely changed gears and pursued a Master's of Landscape Architecture from the University of Sheffield, which is in the UK. And while I was there, I was exposed to so many iconic public gardens as part of this program, from Great Dixter to Sissinghurst Castle to all of these incredible National Trust estates. I also was able to visit many innovative public plantings, including this planting at Pottersfield Park in London. And one thing that all of our professors told us, our planting design professors especially, was they encouraged us to get experience in as much of the green industry as possible, in as many facets as possible. And I really took that to heart. So when I graduated, instead of working at a firm, I went on to intern for a year in horticulture at Winterthur. And then I worked in Longwood Gardens in their natural lands department. I worked at a wholesale nursery, North Creek Nurseries in Landenberg, Pennsylvania. And most recently, I was a horticulturist and then garden manager at Stoneleigh, which is not too far from Jenkins on the main line. I now work in residential design and gardening at a private property here in southeastern Pennsylvania, where I design and oversee the installation of new landscapes, but also care for an array of dynamic garden areas. I also help care for habitats, including woodlands, riparian areas, and meadows. And I feel very, very lucky to care for the landscapes that I design because I learn so much. I learn, how plants and planting, groups change over time. I learn who eats these plants. I learn what plants can tolerate, and I'm really happy to be able to share these things with you tonight. So again, if you're here tonight, it's probably because you've at least heard of native plants and you want to know more, or maybe you're an expert. But wherever you are on the spectrum of the native plant life that I'm a native plant enthusiast. I just want to make sure we're on the same page in terms of what we're talking about when we talk about native plants. So if you Google it, there are many, many definitions out there, but I really like this one that comes from Doug Tallamy and Rick Dark from their book, The Living Landscape. Doug Tallamy is a rock star professor of entomology and wildlife ecology at the University of Delaware. And he and Rick Dark define native in this book as a plant or an animal that has evolved in a given place over a period of time sufficient to develop complex and essential relationships with the physical environment and other organisms in a given ecological community. So essentially, this definition is saying that going beyond a plant's place of origin, where exactly that plant occurred in an area at a certain point of time, just as important are the relationships that that plant has developed with the other organisms in that area over that period of time. So those relationships with other plants, with animals, with even the microorganisms in the soil like fungi and bacteria. What's also important is the ecological function that a native plant has, what benefit they bring to those other beings they're in relation with. So tonight, for our purposes, my definition of native plants will be fairly broad. I'll be talking about plants that find themselves in the eastern United States. I'm choosing here not to be really restrictive about the definition. For example, not only talking about plants that are native to Pennsylvania, because I'm just making the assumption that many of us live in urban and suburban areas, if we're working with small garden spaces. And really, for me, the goal is all about amping up diversity, amping up biodiversity, planting more plants. So why plant native plants? I got into this a little bit, these relationships that plants have with other organisms. But to give you a little bit of context, so in 2022, the World Wildlife Federation came out with the Living Planet report. And it had some alarming news. It found that wildlife populations have plunged by an average of almost 70% since 1970. And much of that loss is caused by habitat destruction. The National Wildlife Federation found that 1 million acres of wildlife habitat are being lost to suburban development annually. So what we plant and how we care for our home gardens can have real observable and meaningful impacts on wildlife. Incorporating a variety of beautiful native plants into your garden and more plants in general really provides an array of benefits to wildlife. It also allows us to connect more deeply to where we live, to our land, to history. And if you have a small garden space, it's even more important to prioritize native species because you are working with that compact area. The more native plants you can include, the more benefits you can bring to all of the other wildlife that's co-evolved with that particular plant. And I will talk about some cultivars of native plants this evening, and these are selections of native plants that have been developed for particular characteristics. Primarily, though, I'll be talking about cultivars that have smaller stature or are potentially kind of more well-behaved when dealing with a smaller space. So back to gardening with a small space, all of this is great. Native plants are great, but if you're working with a very small area, it may feel like you don't have room to do anything fun or creative. But the good news is that nature abhors a vacuum and plants thrive in the smallest of places. So use the opportunity with whatever space you can to fill every nook and cranny with a plant. Just a little bit of inspiration. This is a tiny cafe in Cambodia in the city that is just covered with plants on all sides. You see them in containers at the front of this store. You see vines all over the place, trained on a pergola over the entrance. You see trees that are giving like just wonderful shade in this hot climate. This balcony in a European city, which I'm not sure exactly what European city this is, but maybe Paris, I'm not sure. But you can see there is no ground soil here, but this apartment owner has so many wonderful plants just in containers. But how do you choose plants for these small places? So I love planting designer Benjamin Vogt's kind of short definition or explanation of what to look for. So he says 2 helpful pieces of information we need to know about plants to ensure they're right for a small space are 1, root structure, and 2, sociability. So selecting the right plant for the right place, of course, it's all about, matching the plant to the sun you have, the soil type you have, the exposure you have. And you also want to consider the eventual height and the eventual kind of spread of that plant. But you also want to know how competitive it is with other plants. So I'll break this down, root structure and sociability. So a plant's root structure, we often think about plants in terms of their life above ground. If we're planting things very close together, we might worry about them competing for light. But what about what's happening below ground? So think about a common site in our landscapes. We have a tree that's planted in turf grass. And this wonderful graphic here shows all of these different types of root systems. So turf grasses, or European turf grasses, primarily have fibrous root systems. And our trees do too, and they're in that same soil level. So actually these 2 plants are competing with each other in that first kind of 6 inches of the soil. Many plants have tap roots alternatively, which are much, much deeper and can reach soil moisture and nutrients that are deeper in the soil. And then you have plants that are bulbs or corms, which have much more compact and nutrient-dense root systems. And then how plants reproduce. So does a plant primarily reproduce from a rhizome or a root or from a seed? So, and at what pace? How quickly does it reproduce? So 2 primary ways that plants can reproduce through roots are through rhizomes or through stolons. Rhizomes are kind of underground roots that, may spread sometimes just a couple inches, sometimes a foot if that plant's pretty aggressive. A stolon is actually a shoot that comes out from the plant stem above ground that will put down roots. So those are multiple ways that a plant can spread. And then going along with this, so a commonly used plant sociability rating may go something like this, from 1 to 4, where 1 is not too aggressive, kind of a well-behaved plant that doesn't spread too much, and 4 is a very aggressive plant. Number 1, the plant is primarily a behaved clumper and stays where it is, only growing in stature over time. A great example of this is Blue Falls indigo, Baptisia australis. It has a long taproot. It's pretty slow growing. It tolerates tough, stressful situations like drought. And it stays in one place and it grows slowly over time to its full size. And then it pretty much stays like that. So this is the type of plant that could be good for a small space. Again, a slightly more vigorous plant might creep or self-slow lightly, a number 2. And then on the opposite end of the spectrum, you have number 4s, which give it 5 years and the plant will easily dominate the landscape. An example of this would be our native sunchoke, Helianthus tuberosus, which is a lovely, beautiful plant, as you can see, but it might not be a great plant for a small space. It has tuberous roots that you can eat, which is great, but they spread rhizomatously and aggressively underground to form pretty large colonies. So not so appropriate for a small space, but if you happen to have a large backyard or you're dealing with invasive plant incursions, a plant like this or one of our other vigorous, quickly reproducing native plants might be a great option for you. And then a note on how shrubs reproduce. So some shrubs reproduce rhizomatously, like I mentioned before, or by layering when a branch touching the ground grows roots. Our common blackberry does this in particular. And some do this aggressively, some more slowly. Some slowly spreading shrubs can still be really great in small spaces because you can simply prune out unwanted new shoots once a year, or you can dig them out and you can give them to friends as a new plant. So an example of a slower spreader in most conditions, in my experience, is summer sweet or Clethra alnifolia. Over time, it will send out little new shoots rhizomatously, but it's not so aggressive that it can't be maintained. So how do you know if a plant is really aggressive? Unfortunately, there isn't always information on how a plant spreads when you look at plant descriptions. You'll see that eventual size, the height, and the spread, but you may not always know how the plant's going to behave in a garden situation. Here's an example that has some keywords and phrases that might hint towards being red flags. Again, a wonderful native plant, Chasmanthium latifolium, northern sea oats. I have it in my garden. However, this might not be a great plant for a small space, and you'll see why. So if you see the word naturalize in a plant description, this means it may escape your garden and spread into areas elsewhere, kind of establishing a self-sustaining population. Might not be a good choice for a small garden. If you see the words easily grown, this isn't totally a deal breaker because honestly, I mean, how many of us gardeners really do want plants that are easy to grow? I mean, does anyone want a plant that's hard to grow? But it just may mean that the plant can thrive very well by itself, outcompeting other nearby plants that aren't so vigorous. So just something to keep an eye on. And then if you see something that says self-seeds and may spread aggressively, then that kind of speaks for itself. But some other words to pay attention to if you see them in a plant description might be weedy, vigorous, fast growing, something that colonizes. Really pay heed to these descriptions. I know how hard it is, especially if you're at a nursery and you see a beautiful plant or you see a picture that looks like amazing and you think, I need this in my garden. But if all signs are pointing to that it might be problematic, just think twice. Learn from my mistakes. So moving forward, though, I'm going to talk about plants that are really good for small spaces, the ones and twos. And I'll share some tips for including natives in small spaces as well. So first of all, plant diversely. Plant many different types of plants. You can include an array of plant sizes, plant types from deciduous to evergreen trees, to shrubs, to perennials, grasses, sedges, ferns. Include an array of flower types, bloom times, plant structures, and heights. This not only will allow you to stuff more plants into your garden, but it will also provide more food and cover options for wildlife throughout the seasons. And this is a wonderful example right in the center of Boston, a small planting done by Patrick Kalina at the Rose Kennedy Greenway. And you can see just the variety of undulating heights and forms of plants. You have oaks and sweet bay magnolias as trees. You have sumac as a shrub and all sorts of different perennials. But if you only have space for a few things, prioritize keystone species. Although all native plants are beneficial, some species are absolutely essential to the life cycles of a myriad of species. So, for example, Doug Tallamy and his team have identified that just 14% of native plants, the keystones, support 90% of butterfly and moth species. There's also research that horticulturist Jared Fowler is doing that shows that many North American native bees are pollen specialists who only eat pollen from about 40% of native perennials or native plants. So essentially, there are several native plants out there that are just unbelievable workhorses when it comes to benefiting wildlife. And the first, for those of you who know a lot about native plants, you knew that I was going to talk about oak trees, I'm sure. But oaks are the keystone. They support more life forms than any other North American tree genus. That's food and shelter and habitat for all sorts of animals, from birds to bears to insects, and they support almost 900 caterpillar species in the US, which, you know, why are caterpillars important? They are an incredible source of protein for birds and other animals. So I recommend, and you may be thinking, okay, oak trees, that's great. They get huge. Well, many oak trees do grow to be quite large, but there are some cultivars and some species that do stay a bit smaller. I wanted to talk about the swamp white oak, a cultivar called Beacon. If you have a small space, but you have room for a tree to get tall, this cultivar, it only gets about 15 feet wide at the most and 40 feet tall. There are also a couple species that are much more shrubby oaks that I'd recommend, but they're hard to find in the trade. So if anyone's out here who has a nursery link, see if nurseries can start growing these species. Blackjack oak and dwarf chinkapin oak are both small shrubby oaks that are difficult to find in the trade, but I think we need to start growing them. And then the Prunus genus. So these are plums and cherries. They are another wildlife superstar as a host plant and a pollinator plant, supporting over 400 butterfly and moth species. They are incredible, and many of them are considered small trees. This in particular is Prunus Americana, or American plum. I have several of these in my backyard, and they are beautiful. They have been blooming. They're still blooming right now. These lovely white blooms that are super attractive to pollinators. And I also love it because it has edible fruit. So there are several others listed here: chokeberry, beech plum, chicksaw plum, pin cherry. All of these are smaller trees, considered smaller trees. Just lovely too. Beautiful blooms in the spring. Birches. So another incredible host plant for over 400 Lepidopterous species. Our birches, the birch I would recommend for this region is river birch. It's the most heat tolerant and kind of urban condition tolerant of all of our native birches, but the straight species can get pretty big. This is a picture of one of the top 10 largest birches in the state of Pennsylvania at Stoneleigh, a natural garden. They can get over 60 feet tall. However, there is a cultivar called Little King, sometimes called Fox Valley, that tops out at about 15 feet. And then our keystone perennials. I'll just talk about two here. There are many others, but our goldenrods. All native goldenrods are excellent late season pollinator plants. And these little perennials are host to over 100 butterfly and moth species. But some of our goldenrods can be a little aggressive. They can spread through roots and through seed a bit aggressively. However, these are a couple that are a little bit more suitable for a small garden space. Anise goldenrod, it's really not aggressive at all. It's lovely. It doesn't get too wide, maybe 1 foot wide, 2 to 3 feet tall. An autumn goldenrod only gets about 1.5 feet tall by 1.5 feet wide. This is a picture of it right here with these beautiful yellow blooms. And then our asters, excellent pollinator and host plant again. There are so many lovely asters out there. However, many of them get pretty big and they may reseed if they're pretty happy. However, a couple aster species that I like for small spaces include aromatic aster, also deer resistant. Symphyotrichum oblongifolium. That is a mouthful, that word. There are a couple kind of compact cultivars, October Skies and Radon's favorites, that get about 2.5 feet high by 3 feet wide. They may spread by seed a little bit, but not aggressively in my experience. And then the cutest little aster, Heath aster, a cultivar called Snow Flurry, which is just a creeping, low-growing ground cover, great for bed edges or in a container kind of draping over the sides. Second tip, plant small trees. So trees cannot be rivaled when it comes to carbon sequestration, giving us oxygen, giving us shade and other cooling effects, providing wildlife habitat, privacy. So here are several smaller native trees to plant if you can. Our green hawthorn. There are several native hawthorns, but green hawthorn is one that is available in the trade at nurseries. It typically gets about 25 to 30 feet, 35 feet high. Great pollinator plant. It will be blooming soon, and then has wonderful berries that are attractive to birds in the fall. It's a larval host, all sorts of hair streaks, and just likes full sun, is a great habitat plant. Red buckeye or Aesculus pavia only gets 12, 15 feet high and is great for kind of partial shade conditions as well. And these lovely red flowers, they attract hummingbirds. So if you plant one of these, you will most likely see hummingbirds coming to visit at some point. Our eastern redbud, Cercis canadensis, a commonly known tree, a great native species. It's in the pea family, and the flowers do resemble little pea blossoms. It's beautiful in bud and in bloom, and it has big heart-shaped leaves that turn kind of limey green yellow in the fall. It gets about 20 to 30 feet tall. And then our native fringe tree, Chionanthus virginicus, another spring flowering. Just look at those big floofy blooms. So this tree has both male and female trees, both flower, but if you get a female tree, it produces berries that look a little bit like blue olives and are eaten by birds. And this only, again, gets about 15 to 20 feet tall and wide. And finally, I could do a whole presentation about small trees, but this will be the last one I talk about, our sweet Bay Magnolia or Magnolia virginiana. This is a 10 to 20 foot, typically in height and spread, slow growing, often multi-stem tree. It's like all magnolias, it's beautifully fragrant when it's pruned, and it blooms a little bit later than most of our native flowering trees. Or if a small tree seems too big for your space, consider getting into pruning. I was lucky to visit Japan earlier this year and saw all sorts of incredible examples of pruning. These were 2 courtyards in Kyoto that just had incredibly beautiful artistic pruning done to their trees, and really helped them fit within small spaces. And some other great techniques you can use for keeping trees in a small space are pollarding and coppicing. If you haven't heard of these before, these techniques have been much more common in Europe. Tradition, kind of European woodland management. Larding on the left, you can see here, it's really like regularly pruning trees or shrubs back to form a head of branches. And, this just has to be done from the time that the tree is pretty young, but then you can fit trees in a really narrow space or whatever kind of shaped space you have. Compassing is actually cutting a tree or shrub back to a stump at ground level. And traditionally, this was done to, produce firewood on a regular basis or have straight stems for fencing, but it also keeps a plant pretty small. This could be done annually, or it could be done every 3 to 5 years on a regular rotation. And there's just a list here of several native species that respond well to this type of pruning. Our hazelnuts, our tulip trees, our shrubby dogwoods, elderberry, redbuds, smokebush, willow, and alder. And then think about multifunctionality. So consider plants in your small space that will serve many, many purposes. How many plants can each, how many benefits can each plant you have in your space provide? So when you're looking at selecting plants, make sure that they're not just pretty. It's not enough to just be pretty. You can be providing wildlife value. You can be providing edible food, fruit, nuts, leaves, roots, herbal remedies for yourself, herbs for tea, for all sorts of ailments, dyes, fibers. You can be providing privacy, wind protection, shade, and of course, beauty as well, preventing soil erosion or any other number of kind of landscape problems we have. And then finally, make sure that, every plant you have in your space is bringing you happiness, is something that you want to have there. So I have a couple examples of multifunctional plants, but I realize that all of them are edible, but there are some other uses for these plants. So the highbush blueberry, Vaccinium corymbosum, is just the perfect example of a multifunctional plant. Of course, it has the edible berries, that's a win right there, but the flowers are also beautiful and very attractive to bumblebees and other pollinators. If you don't eat the berries, you are feeding the birds. You are creating a wonderful food source for a whole bunch of different birds. And then it has gorgeous fall color. It can provide privacy. And if you have kind of a wet space where nothing seems to grow, a blueberry might be the right choice. There are many, many different cultivars of blueberries. I know that Jenkins has at least one blueberry cultivar on their plant sale list, but many out there of different sizes. But typically, they don't get more than anywhere from like 6 to 12 feet tall and wide. Black chokeberry, Aronia melanocarpa. This is a lovely shrub that has white spring blooms and edible berries, although unlike blueberries, you probably don't want to eat these raw. You want to make a pie or a jam. There is a reason why it's called chokeberry. It's a little bit tart. They have excellent fall color, and the berries can also be used to create like a light purple dye. There are a couple cultivars. So the straight species, it gets about 3 to 6 feet tall and wide, but there are some really small cultivars. One called ground hug, which is kind of ground cover, only gets a little bit more than a foot tall and 3 feet wide. And then low scape mound, which is about 2 feet by 2 feet. And our serviceberry, Amelanchier canadensis. This is a small tree with airy, delicate spring blooms, blooming where I am right now. And again, it has edible fruits, very much blueberry-like, if you can get to them before the cedar waxwings and other birds do. And young serviceberry stems actually were often used in basketry and furniture making and rope making and all sorts of other tools. So there's multiple uses for many plants. This particular species gets about 25 to 30 feet tall, but there are several other amelanchiers that get to be different sizes. So we talked about big things. Let's talk about little things, little plants. Ground covers or green mulch. So plant densely and cover the ground is the next tip. If you have ever been on a nature walk, you've probably noticed, unless you're in an area where the deer have decimated the understory of the forest, that the soil's almost always hidden. Plants fill every little spatial niche, including the ground. So when you plant densely, it prevents you from having to mulch every year. It reduces weed pressure by covering all the bare ground. You aren't providing any spaces for unwanted plants. And here's just a little example from my garden where you have a ground cover of common blue violet or Viola aureola with plants kind of popping up out of it, like this golden Alexander or Zizia aurea. So by choosing plants with varying heights and forms, you can add variety without having plants drown each other out. A couple examples of wonderful ground covers, although there are so many more. One that's blooming right now that I love, and there are lots of different color cultivars of this, and you can actually see it in the wild in our local serpentine barrens, is moss Phlox subulata. This does love full sun, so it's really good kind of at the edges of beds or, again, draped over containers. It only gets about 6 inches tall and will spread about 2 feet. Blooms, like I said, in spring, and great for erosion control, and the flowers attract all sorts of pollinators, including hummingbirds, butterflies, skippers, bees. Just a great plant, showy. Heartleaf foam flower or Tiella cordifolia. Another spring bloomer with lovely, delicate star-like white blooms and really attractive heart-shaped ground cover foliage that turns a beautiful kind of coppery red in the fall. Only gets about 1 foot high and spreads about 2 feet. So all of these ground covers, they do spread a little bit, but they're not spreading incredibly aggressively. Wild ginger, Asarum canadense. This one is a lovely deer-resistant ground cover. Again, not aggressive. It'll get about 1 foot tall and about 1 foot wide over time, creeping slowly over time. It has really cool deep burgundy colored flowers, but they're hidden beneath the foliage, so you really have to look for them. And it's the larval host for the pipevine swallowtail. Last ground cover I'll talk about are sedges. These amazing grassy, grass-like ground covers intermingle perfectly with other perennials, with shrubs, with trees, with other ground covers even. They're a great turf alternative, great for erosion control, all sorts of things. And really, there are so many species of sedges. There is definitely one out there for whatever garden conditions you have. And I just gave a couple examples of kind of top performers for dry soil and for more moist soil from, if you're familiar with Mount Cuba Center, another wonderful public garden in our region, they do these excellent trials of plants for our region, and it's all of the results are on their website for free, so you can look up the sedge trial and you can learn all about different sedge species and how they perform in a typical garden setting and find out which one might be right for you. But you can see right here, this is a wonderful ground cover underneath Amsonia, which is another perennial, and they're working really well, and this area will never need to be mulched. It will be weeded rarely because the sedge is such a great ground cover. Another tip, consider adding a layer of spring ephemerals. So right now in our native woodlands, there are spring ephemerals blooming everywhere. The bluebells are out around me. I just drove by them this morning on one of our back roads. And if you're not super familiar with spring ephemerals, so these are native woodland perennials, which complete most of their annual life cycle within each spring. So before the tree canopy has completely leafed out, there's more light. So they usually flower and they set seed and they go dormant by summer. So what this means is if you planted a Virginia bluebell in your garden and didn't plant anything else around it, your garden would be bare soil by summer for the rest of the season. So this is a great, great opportunity to have two plants in one place. They pair really, really well with kind of later emerging perennials, things like ferns, warm season grasses that really don't get up and growing until around now, and they can kind of come up as the spring ephemerals are going down, or even kind of summer blooming or late summer blooming perennials. So in this case right here, we have a picture of the Virginia bluebells paired with ostrich fern or Matutia struthiopteris. However, I would not recommend ostrich fern for a small space because it spreads pretty happily through rhizomes. A couple other excellent spring ephemerals. There are so many. I know Jenkins is selling a lot of them. One I love though is Trillium. There are so many species of Trillium, but this one in particular, look at that burgundy, deep red bloom. This is called Sweet Little Betsy, and I just love the mottled foliage. There's just something about Trilliums that are absolutely beautiful. They spread slowly through underground rhizomes, but they really are kind of generally slow growing plants and really, really special kind of iconic woodland spring ephemerals in the East. And I only included one more here, but this is Jacob's ladder or Polemonium reptans. Another lovely, just blue bloom in the springtime that might actually refresh its foliage later in the summer if it has enough soil moisture. Super attractive to bumblebees, and it can in some cases be deer resistant. It gets only about 1.5 feet tall and wide. And here you can see it's paired with some sedges. Another tip, use all planes and surfaces. So if you have limited horizontal space and ground space, just grow up. There's planting potential on trees, on shrubs, on fences, on walls. You can also create climbing structures for plants using recycled or found materials. You know, pieces of bamboo, 3 pieces can be put together to create a tripod that can allow vines to grow. There are many other opportunities, whether it's through hanging baskets or plant stands, window boxes, containers, all sorts of things. And this is actually the Singapore airport where there were just plants everywhere. This was looking up at the ceiling. They had all sorts of things growing on these hanging structures. It was very inspirational. And here are a couple of other examples of ways that you can train plants. Again, like I mentioned, every fence is an opportunity to grow a vine. An arbor, you know, if you have an entryway to your garden, you can put an arbor there. It doesn't take up any extra space. And then think about all of that other planting surface that you have. And don't just plant 1 vine, plant 3 vines, plant 4. Every container, you know, it doesn't mean you just have to have things draping over that container. You can put a climbing structure in that container. This is at Scott Arboretum in Swarthmore. And a couple vines that are good for smaller spaces because they're not too vigorous. The first one is coral or trumpet honeysuckle, Lonicera sempervirens. This is hands down my favorite native vine. It thrives in full sun to partial shade, and it blooms around mid-spring, but then it blooms kind of intermittently throughout the rest of the season. And these bright red, again, blooms will attract hummingbirds and all sorts of other long-tongued pollinators. It gets like about, I'm not sure if I just said this, but 3 to 20 feet long, but If it gets a little bit too big, it responds just fine to pruning. And because it kind of reblooms throughout the season, you don't have to worry about sacrificing the blooms. And then we have several species of native clematis that aren't too aggressive, that are really actually very delicate and just could lightly creep through trees or shrubs or be trained on a trellis or a fence. And some of my favorites are scarlet clematis or Clematis texensis or vase vine, Clematis viorna. And then just because you have a small space doesn't mean you can't use kind of repetition, whether that's repetition of actually the same plant or of a form or a color or a texture. Repetition can really help make a garden feel united. I really like using this design element in my gardens. So what's nice is that I'll share with you a couple native plants now that do seed around, but not so aggressively that they take over. And instead, these native plants can kind of, you can plant one and then you can have it multiply and fill in the bare spots throughout your garden, but they won't crowd things out. They won't take up too much space. They really mingle well with others. So nodding onion or Allium cernuleum is definitely one of these. It really only gets about 1 foot wide and 1.5 feet tall, and it's an ornamental onion, so that strappy foliage doesn't really shade anything out. It can grow right next to other things and not really bother them. It has these lovely, like pale pink to white flowers, super attractive to butterflies and other pollinators, and it is deer resistant, being having kind of garlic and onion scented foliage. Our eastern columbine, the species is red, but this is a cultivar called Corbett. I have it in my garden, and I just really like this dainty pale yellow flower. Columbine is a shorter lived perennial, so it only might live in your garden for a couple years, but it may spread by seed to little spots in your garden that are open. It's lovely popping up next to other plants. It looks good next to everything. And then finally, butterfly milkweed or Asclepias tuberosa. This is famously one of our milkweeds, which is a larval host to the monarch butterfly. But look at all of these other pollinators that are just loving this plant. I love butterfly milkweed because it's vibrantly orange as well, which is a little bit rarer for our native plants. And the stature of this plant, it's pretty, tops out about 3 feet, if that. And it has kind of narrow foliage. It doesn't shade things out again, and it will pop up here and there if it's happy. It will seed around. And then my last tip is consider raised beds or containers. The edges created by hardscape material can really help keep plants out of pathways and restrict the growth of more rampant plants if you do want to include some vigorous species in your garden. And containers, of course, work well in places where you just don't have access to in-ground soil, whether it's your front steps or a balcony, even inside. And a couple of things to keep in mind if you are doing native plants in containers. Just make sure if you're doing a mixed container that you're combining species with similar needs for water, for sun, soil type, and drainage. And if these plants are going to be in a container long-term, you will want to change out that soil. You will want to fertilize because it is not a natural system. This particular container is it's a large container that's in partial sun that has pretty moderately medium moisture soil. And of course, the theme was white here. So we have a compact cultivar of bald cypress at the center, Virginia sweet spire in bloom, an oak sedge as a filler, as well as woodland stonecrop that's kind of creeping over the edges with little white starlight blooms too. And then a trumpet honeysuckle, a yellow cultivar called John Clayton that's just creeping and lovely and draping over the sides. And then for containers as well, consider perennials that have really attractive foliage throughout the entire season. Things like Tiella or foam flower, heucheras or coral bells have all sorts of different foliage and beautiful foliage and bloom as well. Penstemon in the background, you can see that green with a tinge of red in the back of this container. So there are several cultivars of penstemon that have red in them. And then some evergreen ferns, like the Christmas fern, are also a great option for looking good all season. But if you're like me and you like low maintenance, consider some plants that have kind of low water needs. There are several tough drought-tolerant species that would be good for this kind of container in full sun. A lot of our native grasses, our prairie grasses, like little blue stems, Schizocarium, Scoparium, they don't get too tall and they are very drought-tolerant. Blue grama grass or Blutelua gracilis, a cultivar called Blonde Ambition, has a really wonderful texture and amazing drought tolerance. And then there are also other species, whether it's Eastern red cedar, if you want great texture and evergreen foliage throughout the season, or even our native yuccas or prickly pear cactuses provide great texture throughout the entire season and don't need a lot of water. And then finally, if you really want to grow something that spreads through its roots and is going to take over your garden, consider planting it in a container. Something like our bee balms or our mountain mints tend to spread through runners, through those rhizomes. So just put them in a container. In this case, it is a stump, but this is a cultivar of Monarda. There are so many out there, but it's not going to spread and overtake this space because it's in a nice little stump. And finally, I just wanted to share some local native plant sources because I get that question a lot. So where can we buy these things? You know, it's great that places like Home Depot and Lowe's are starting to include more native plants, but really I would encourage you to support the local organizations, whether they are public gardens, whether they're nonprofits, or independent garden centers that really just are incredible experts on native plants that are growing plants ethically and with good practices. And these are just some of the local sources of native plants that I recommend. And also some recommended reading. These are plants both about native or, these are some books that are about native plants, include some really great lists with kind of plant descriptions, a little bit about how large plants will get. But also a couple of these books are a little bit more about plant sociability, so how plants interact with each other if you're interested in that, particularly planting in a post-wild world and new naturalism. Go into that a little bit more. And that's it. Thank you. I can take questions if you have any.
I'm coming back, Laura. I just have a setting. I need to put myself back in here. There we are. Thank you so much. That was wonderful. Very inspiring to think about your small spaces. I too have a small space at home, so. And we do have some questions that started to come in, so we'll start from the top. When you were speaking about some of the plants, you mentioned cultivars along the way. Do the cultivars that you mentioned still provide similar benefits to wildlife like the street species?
So as far as I know, they do. However, there really needs to be a lot more research done about, there really is very limited research actually about cultivars and their benefits compared to the species in many cases. That's why many of the cultivars that I did provide examples of are simply cultivars that are based on smaller stature. So many of those were selected from a group of other plants, whether they were species or other cultivars, and just looked a little bit smaller. So in all likelihood, in most cases, they're going to have all of those benefits that the species would, only that they're a little bit smaller.
Are there native plum varieties resistant to black knot that you know of?
So that's a good question. Black knot is just one of those things that our cherries, I mean, native and non-native, are susceptible to. However, I do know of, especially, I've seen black cherries in the woods, in the wild, that have it and continue to persist. So definitely not a reason not to plant it. I still think that you should plant cherries, because if you give them everything else they need, if they're healthy, they can live a long time, even with black knot in the area.
Any specific ground covers or low growing plants for a hell strip area between sidewalk and street that is in full sun with dry, poor soil?
Well, that Heath Aster is a really great one. Oh man, there's so many wonderful, great native ground covers. I'm trying to think of a book that might give some great ideas. I think Planting in a Post-Wild World would probably give a better picture of kind of a wider list of things. Again, Opuntia humifusa, or eastern prickly pear, would definitely be a great kind of low-growing ground cover. Again, also if you want to keep people out of your yard. And the other thing, the other plant I love is Calathea involucrata. It's also called, well, the common name is wine cups, and it has this beautiful kind of vibrant pink flower. And it's super drought tolerant, and it will just creep around and fill up a whole space within the season. And you can kind of prune it if it kind of drapes over out of the health strip. You can just prune it back, but you probably won't want to because it's so pretty. But yeah, wine cups.
This question is, when you were talking about the sedges, do you recall which sedge, it says which sedge was under the Amsonia? I'm assuming that was in the photo.
Oh yeah, I think so. That photo was taken at Coastal Maine Botanic Garden, so you can go there and visit if you want to see it yourself. But I'm pretty sure it was Carex pennsylvanica. Historically, that has been the most widely available sedge in the trade, but more and more now you're seeing many different species. And Carex pennsylvanica is really pretty good for drier shade and partial shade conditions.
Is it okay to mix annuals and natives in containers?
I think that's a great idea. I think that's something that, you know, we don't often talk about in presentations about native plants and in discussions about native plants. Of course, we're aspiring for like 100, % native garden, right? But the reality is, at least in my experience, of all the gardens I've seen, of my garden even, it's not 100% native. Many of us who have property, we bought it and someone took care of that land before, and there may be, the weeping willow, or there may be the Japanese flowering cherry, and we don't want to cut that down. So I think many of us, just in a general sense, are gardening with natives and non-natives. And to go back to your point about containers with annuals and native plants, I think it's great to do combinations like that, because having a container that has, native perennials and native shrubs and trees, those can be your stalwart plants that, are the structure, and they stay in the container for the entire season, even through the winter. But then you can add color throughout each season with annuals. Why not? I actually have containers right now that the center is a native yucca, and then I have some sedges, and I may experiment with some other natives in there too, but everything else, it's annual, and I'm just going to pop them in and out, from the spring to the summer to the fall. So yeah, I think that's a great idea.
Have you heard that if you plant any milkweeds that you need to plant at least 5 to 10 plants for the monarchs instead of planting only one? The monarch caterpillars will not have enough food. Yeah, can you speak to a little bit about planting milkweeds and maybe good ratios in the garden?
So in all honesty, I'm not an expert on the exact number of plants that of milkweeds that you would need to have a sufficient amount of food for a monarch. I would highly recommend, I think Heather Holm has some good resources, and the Xerces Society's website has some good resources that might have more specifics about that. I would say planting as many milkweed plants as you can is great, but also other, other pollinator plants for the entire season, really trying to have blooms from as early in the season to as late in the season as possible, because you want to support the adult monarchs throughout their lifespan as well, not just the babies when they're eating that milkweed plant.
Can any of the small trees that you spoke about tonight thrive in pots if you're concerned about roots interfering with the sidewalk?
That's a great idea. I think it's worth experimenting with whether it's a shrub or a tree in a container. I would say, advice-wise, get a container that's as large as you can, just to allow for as much root structure as possible. And if it is a smaller container or a small space, you can consider pruning the tree so that there's more of an even ratio of branching to roots if you have a small container. And again, adding compost or fertilizer to that container to ensure that there's enough nutrition for that tree too is important.
Wonderful. I think, just was going to say, I think that took us through the questions and one popped in. So I'll still say that if there's anyone out there still listening who wants to get a question in, please feel free to do that now. This question is, are there any shrubs that you can kind of train, I guess, more in like a tree shape?
Oh, I mean, really, shrubs love to be pruned, so I would try that with any shrub. I think actually, and if I had another hour, I would have talked about a whole bunch of different shrubs that you can really use as trees. You know, shrubs like viburnums, which can get quite tall, you could train it as a multi-stemmed tree. You could have it as a multi-stem small tree. That would be the highest recommendation for me. Several azaleas as well, our native azaleas, are wonderful. They can get quite large, but you could train them as a multi-stemmed, beautifully branching tree as well. And what's great about our native azaleas too is they aren't so densely branched that, they create really deep shades. So you can grow so many wonderful perennials around them and under them too, as you can see at Jenkins.
Yes, I would agree. And anyone who wants to see wonderful examples of native azaleas and rhododendrons, please do come to Jenkins if you're local or want to take a trip to Devon. Some of them are just like our Pinkster bloom is kind of one of that first early blooming natives that are just starting to pop on property, and the show will just continue from there. So, yeah. Well, thank you so much, Laura. And I love that you mentioned Heather Holm. because we're actually having her speak for the third Thursday lecture in June. Now, she's not going to be touching on anything to do with monarchs, but she will be talking about native predatory wasps. So that'll be fun. And I also did want to mention our upcoming May lecture, which is by Mike Weilbacher. He's the author of a book called Wild Philly, and he'll be doing a presentation related to his book and talking all about the extraordinary nature of our backyards. So we're looking forward to that as well. But Laura, thank you so much for being with us tonight and sharing your expertise. I know so many people tuned in and got a lot of really great ideas. And as I mentioned, we are recording tonight, and I will have that recording to share with those who want to go back and review some of the tidbits. And then I'll also be taking some of the resources from tonight's lecture and adding those to our resource page as well. So Laura, thanks again. Good luck with the rest of the spring season. And hopefully we'll connect with you again soon.
Yeah, thank you, Amy, and thank you, everyone, and happy gardening.
Yes, happy gardening. All right, good night, everybody.